Hey, today's topic is going to be about map control, specifically about map control used in all the variations of games I watch, but I'll just focus on StarCraft 2, Dota 2, and CSGO for now. Basically, map control, the theories of map control, how to use it, how it works in every game is similar to an extent. And this is something I've noticed as I've watched more and more StarCraft 2, more and more Dota 2, more and more CSGO as time has gone on. And so I'm just going to lay out the fundamental theories of how I think map control works in these various types of games. And in general, I think there are, broadly speaking, three types of map control, categorized from my own history with StarCraft 2 as Tasia, Life, and MVP. And how they each of them used that map control was very different. So I'll first get into Tasia. Tasia, for those who don't know, was an all-time great player in StarCraft 2. He was a Terran player, and among all the players in StarCraft 2, he was one of the hardest for people to understand what he was doing. And the reason was because his style was such that he wasn't actually actively doing anything. What he was doing was he was passively getting information all the time. And this either came from his intuition, his practice, or his general knowledge of the game. And so he would be able to accurately assess every situation on the map with very limited amounts of information at any given time. And this was a guy who was surprisingly meticulous despite how little practice he apparently did relative to other players. Or like if he was scouted with an SCV early on, and if he knew all the timings of the probes, because probes have a limited build time even when you use the chrono boost. So if you count the seconds and then you reach there at the moment, depending on your scout route, you know if they should have an extra probe or not. And if they don't have an extra probe, then Tasia can immediately figure out there's a proxy on the map. And depending on their gas count, he can figure out what type of proxy it is, and then he can counter it. Right? That's like a very basic way he would do that. But a much more significant way is in the later stages of the game. This is where he was a god, in a sense. And what he did was he figured out the map objectives of the entire game. So based off of your composition, based off of your play style, based off of how many bases are remaining, based off of critical points on the map, so watchtowers, obviously a big point, but so are critical linkage areas, which I'll explain that right now. It's like areas where if you take that area and you can pivot into by taking a specific area. How do I explain this? Okay, so imagine in CS:GO when you take Mirage mid control. At that point, you can pivot into like multiple areas of attack or cache mid control. Actually, is probably a better example because there's like miniature like linkage areas from that mid area in Mirage, whereas there isn't so much a cache. So if you're able to take a cache mid control as T, you have a lot of different ways you can break open the sites. You can go down the center and split from multiple angles. You can go A split, you can go B split, you can fake, you can do all kinds of things. So that's what I call like a link control area, because it's like linking all the different areas on the map, or it's like it lets you pivot into different types of attacks. And Tasia was kind of a master at figuring out which of these areas he needed to contest, and he would just control it passively because obviously you would think of it as a sense of attack, but in Tasia's case, you could think of it as a sense of defense. And from those same areas, he's able to limit the aggressive options of whoever he was playing against, figure out their next move and counter that move, and figure out their next move and counter that move. So he's constantly playing a defensive game, and this is actually what frustrated Reign when they played each other at WCS 2013 Season 1 Finals, is because this is the first time Reign will have ever played against a player like Tasia, because there is no other player like Tasia in the history of StarCraft 2 when you're talking about the Terran race. And so Reign had no idea how to deal with it, and Reign became frustrated, and then Reign like broke because Reign like prided himself on being the best late game PvT player, and then he got broken by Tasia, who proved himself to be an even better late game player than Reign was. Right? And so this is kind of what I talk about Tasia. a more explicit example for Tasia is when we're talking about passive map control is in TVZ he would never commit full time onto the creep unless he believed it was the final gamble. And what I mean by final gamble is like his situation was precarious enough where the attack on the creep was arguably his best chance of winning the game. And that's but for the most part, if it was an even game, or if it was a game where he believed he could drain out the enemy, as he did against Sue at BlizzCon, he would actually not fully attack on creep. He would just take out the edges of the creep and slowly push forward and passively wait for information on the very edge. So he had a lot of, so he was from that style of like passive control. He's able to see what's coming, and because of his own intuition, his own knowledge, he's able to counter what is going to happen to him. So his very style made it so that a lot of people, as in like everybody he ever played against in a weekender specifically, like went into him and then died a lot of the times. And that's also the reason why he has arguably the highest win rate against all the other greatest of all time players compared to anybody else on the list, is because he made it very hard to overwhelm. He made it very hard for the opponent to get into a better position against him, and made it even harder for the opponent to do something that could surprise him. So that's why Tasia was so strong. And when I talk about Tasia, specifically his map control, it's a very passive style, but passive is kind of a vague term just because it implicitly means like you're sitting back and you're doing nothing, whereas no, what you're actually doing is you're taking these forward positions and you are getting the information, and then from that information you're able to fall off immediately, and you will have gained the information, your opponent will have given away information, and you will have lost nothing. So in that exchange you're actually winning. It's a very hard style to pull off, and obviously there's like a lot of pressure when you do that kind of style, because it requires a lot of thinking, requires a lot of decision making, and it's not as you can't full on focus as you can like on attack, because you're always thinking of the next step, the next position, the next place you have to go to. So it's a very strong style, arguably the strongest style if we're talking about theoretics of aggression versus macro like passive play, or in card terms it might be like the beatdown deck and then the like the control deck, so to speak, right? But we are going to go to the opposite, his complete opposite, which is Life. And Life was a player who wasn't about passive map control, he was about aggressive map control. This was a guy who understood on the highest levels of aggressive thinking that StarCraft 2 has ever produced. And what I mean by that is the way he fought, the way he attacked, the way he played. It was a control not only on, it was a control on everything you were doing. So he always took, like in chess terms, he'd always play the white pieces because he'd always make the first move. But he wasn't afraid of giving you the information on what he was doing, because by attacking, you're also gaining information. And unlike other attackers, he had a much better intuitive understanding of what he could get away with and when he'd push, when not to push. So he would attack, but then he would back off if he thought the attack was not going so well. And then he understands from the other person's perspective of what the other player is doing at that moment in StarCraft 2. So this is going to get into a very complicated theoretical discussion in StarCraft 2 nobody's ever talked about. But basically when you're talking about StarCraft 2, there are specific areas of mental chains you have to go through in order to play the game of StarCraft 2. What I mean by that is there is a process, a guide, a mental guide that every StarCraft 2 player builds in their head. So for instance, the most basic one is when you first start playing StarCraft 2, the first thing you do is you hotkey all the buttons, and then you just start spamming over and over again, boxing over the drones to warm up your hands, warm up your keyboard, and you build up the area hotkeys, and you just start spamming through them. And the reason you do this is because you want your mind to get used to the constant switching of the screens, the constant influx of information that's coming into your mind, and you want to be able to, in some way, put that into a subconscious, intuitive level, so you don't have to think when a move is done by the opponent or vice versa when you do a move on them. Whereas Life was, because he was playing this aggressive style, he was taking control of the mental chains in your mind. He was breaking them down. He was putting stress, and because he was putting stress, he could kind of figure out in an intuitive way that what you wanted to do next, because you were being put under pressure. So you would counterattack because you would think in your mind, okay, he is obviously droning at this moment, so I'm going to counterattack, I'm going to attack, I'm going to win. And he would add some drones for sure, but he would actually add up a bit more army, and then just as you are pushing out, there's this moment where you go back to your normal macro mental chain, so to speak. You would go back to each of your bases. You're scrolling through like the areas, and then you go back to your army, and you keep doing this over and over again. And he'd always be able to figure out at which moment you were doing this for some reason, and he would always attack. He would always attack at the exact moment your army was not there and your eyes weren't there. Much more importantly, because that's actually one of the weirdest parts about Life's counterattacks compared to every other player in StarCraft 2 was how successful they were. And the reason they were so successful wasn't because his opponents were lazy or his opponents were caught off guard. It was because his opponents were not looking at the screen at that very moment, and he consistently hit this timing every single time. There's no player like that in StarCraft 2 history. There will never be another player like that in StarCraft 2 history. That's my guess. And the reason this is so genius is because when we're talking about Life's aggression, basically it gives him all the information he wants, all the information he needs, and he's not only that, he's also dictating what information he wants to be created. And this is what I call aggressive map control, and it's a bit different from other types of map control in the sense that it seems more brain dead, but it's actually just a higher level of understanding. But it's very hard to do, and obviously Tasia, this is like a once in a lifetime sort of player we've seen in StarCraft 2 when it comes to this type of aggressive map control. And so I've talked about the passive map control of Tasia. I've talked about the aggressive map control of Life, so to speak. And now we come to the third guy, and you would think between the two of them that they would have talked about every type of map control, but there's actually a third type, which I've mentioned once on Counterpoints. I kind of called it like phantom map control, but it's basically mental map control. It might be a better way to put it. And this is the part where MVP comes into play, because MVP was, in my opinion, the mentally the strangest and strongest StarCraft 2 player we've ever seen. And what I mean by that is he wasn't just thinking in terms of builds or races, timings, or compositions. He was also thinking in terms of player and player psychology. And so he'd always be able to create space for himself within a best of 5 or best of 7 series. And that's what makes him such an exceptional player if he got time to prepare, despite all the crazy shit that happened to him outside of the game. And there's a lot of examples I could go into, but I'll go with one of the more basic ones. Was in GSL Season 4 2012, he plays against Rain in the semifinals. And what he does against Rain is he understands Rain better than Rain understands Rain. And what I mean by that is, if you know Rain as a player, Rain was the true late game Protoss player. He believed utterly and without an ounce of doubt that he would beat anybody if he got into the late game. So he was always willing to play a more standard game. He was always willing to be a little bit more conservative with his openings, with his economic greed, so to speak. And MVP knew that. MVP understood that, and MVP in a best of 5 series started the series off with 2 very all-in builds. And this puts Rain on edge. So the remaining 3 games, Rain plays even more conservatively, he plays even more passively. He plays, and then I don't mean like Tasia passively, I mean like just straight up like hold up in his base, like please, like if he comes, I auto win, right? That's kind of how Rain was thinking about it. And because he did all this, MVP knew he was going to do all of this, and then MVP went the opposite route, where he went super greedy, he cut all the corners, he got a massive army, and critically, ends up winning that series by pulling off something nobody had ever done before, which is nobody had ever done to that extent before, which was pull almost all his SCVs and then do it all in at this critical moment, or there was like a disparity between their army supplies, and that's how MVP beats Rain, so to speak. Even though Rain was legitimately a much better player, MVP was smarter, and MVP understood the psychosis of Rain, and that's what I call mental map control. And it's a very specific type of control where you're not actually, or you're in a sense figuring out the patterns and tendencies of other players, of other teams, and using that to in a sense break down what they are going to do, and then what they are going to, how you're going to counter that. So it's not necessarily aggressive or passive, because in a sense it depends on who you are playing against how this kind of map control would work. But it is a style of map control where you cannot necessarily put it in the aggressive or passive category or in the Tasia or Life categories of map control. So that's why he gets his own variant, or in my own model of how I look at map control. And how does this work? I've only been talking about StarCraft 2 for now, but how does this work in team games like Dota 2, like CSGO? And specifically, when you're talking about the all-encompassing like map control, the way you have to think about it is when you talk about Tasia, he wasn't necessarily a guy who would like, if you talk about the way Tasia played, he is more of a 4-1 player. And when we're talking about Dota 2, and what I mean by that is a majority of his army is put into one area, but he would split off pieces of it to gain information and to harass the enemy and to pull back the enemy and figure out what is going on, right? That's kind of Tasia's style of play, but it was like a choking style. He would, like, the 4 wouldn't go in, the 1 would go in, but he could sacrifice the 1 because he could rebuild that in a sense. And that's kind of his style of play, if you want to put it in terms of the team game. And when we talk about the team game, specifically Dota 2 and CSGO, you basically have 5 players on each team. And so when you talk about map control, you have to realize that you gain the most information when you split up the entire team, so to speak. And this is actually how, like, that's how the default works in CSGO, and that's kind of how the default works in Dota 2, or can work. So that's why you always have at least 1 player in each lane in Dota 2, and then the remaining 2 players are used depending on, obviously, the hero, the lane, the meta, the matchup, stuff like this. Or they can wander around, or maybe one of them will go jungle, or maybe both of them will go jungle. There's a bunch of strange combinations you can play in Dota 2. And we're talking about map control, but when we talk about Dota 2 and the map control, there's a few ways to think about it. Right? So there is the domino effect, I guess. This is a different type, but I categorize it under, like, the aggressive type of life, where basically the idea of, like, the domino effect is, depending on the heroes, sometimes there's a critical tower you need to take the fuck out of the enemy opponents. And the reason you need to take this out is because, for instance, if you take out the bottom Radiant tower, what happens is you take over their fucking jungle. And if you take over their jungle, you have effectively cut off one player's farm, depending on the hero set, and now you have created now because of your aggressive information taking, you've created a scenario where the other team has to respond in very specific ways, and you know how they're going to respond. And this is kind of how the current Liquid plays, in a sense, where they understand how to take the first tower, and then what that first tower implicates for the next map control, like information, and how the enemy would react to that. Right? So that's the aggressive style. The more passive style is obviously the farming style of yay old 4 protect 1, which is the Chinese style where you're willing to sacrifice each lane, but because you sacrifice each lane with for the players. Everything, all the rest of the farm is going to the one player. Obviously, in this case, I'm thinking of like a burning AM, but we've seen this with plenty of other players too, like Eternal Envy on AM, pretty similar. But basically, when you go run into this style, it's actually a weird combination, and this is where team map control differs from 1v1 map control. When you're talking about StarCraft 2, is you have a combination of both passive and aggressive players on a team, and they have to realize which role they are in a particular draft, in a particular team, and how to play out that role in a particular strategy. So, for instance, when we're talking about the 4 Protect 1, the 4 players are all passive, but the 1 player has to be super aggressive, and this player has to, on some level, be farming all of the time in very dangerous areas. And this is actually why carry players are sometimes underrated, just because in order to do that, it requires a lot of intuition, a lot of understanding of the game and map movement and all this. So it's very hard to do, especially because if in this scenario, if the 4 Protect 1, it's often the case your team isn't able to get wards out on the map, so you're farming a dangerous life. And as Eternal Envy explains it, basically if he dies once, the game's over. So that's why he would go for like a double rapier or something crazy like that, because that's kind of how the strategy ends up working in a sense. And so I've talked about aggressive, I've talked about kind of passive, and how does this work in CSGO? Because I've talked about StarCraft, talked a bit about Dota 2. How does this work in CSGO? In CSGO, it like I said, it gets a little bit complicated just because of the way the teams and the individuals work is kind of like a cyclic, symbiotic sort of relationship where the team, in a sense, informs the players, but the players also inform the teams, inform how the team plays. And it depends on how the team is built. But when we're talking about the aggressive, oppressive type of map control, the lifestyle, the obvious one for a slow type of style would be SK T-side of Mirage, where it's like the 1-1-1-1-1, where they are spread out all across the map, but they make it so that in a sense they're all interconnected, but in a sense they're all playing individually. So it's very hard. So once they take that map control, it's very hard to take it back, and from that point on, they put a lot of stress, a lot of pressure on the defending players of the sites of how to rotate, of where to play, what to do, and that's how they break open the sites. And the point, and you can kind of figure out, like I said earlier, the 1-1-1-1-1, or if you spread out all the players individually like that, you would think there'd be like a weak link somewhere, because obviously in other CSGO teams, for instance, they play more like a 1-3-1, where like the 3 players are the ones taking like the most dangerous part of the map control that requires the most nades, requires the most manpower to trade out if anybody challenges you. Whereas in this scenario, like you could probably create like a 2v1, but because of where the map positions are, they can trade you out. Because of how some of the players play, like Bolts is super passive, you can't really get to him without dying, and he might kill you and just get away anyway. So it becomes a very complicated scenario where the answer is probably you have to kill the tempo makers of this style, or slow them down. So in the Phelps version, it would be both Taco and Fur, but in the modern version, probably just be Fur and maybe Cold. That's kind of how you would do that on Mirage, and that's like a slow paced aggressive style. And then there's like a more fast paced aggressive style where you see this a bit at like when Cloud9 won the Boston Major, where they would split very fast, but based off of information they would get, Tarek would immediately make a call of going one side or the other immediately, depending on what one player saw when they went down, or what one player did. And so that's like another variation of like the aggressive style, where you're basically like taking control of the entire game before they can react or do anything. Instead of like this oppressive style of SK, it's more like a very fast adaptive style. Right. And then when we're talking about the mental map control, I think Fur is probably the best explanation for it. And you should look at the SK versus FaZe matchups, specifically on Overpass. The first few times they play, basically Fur ruins everything for them with his overt aggression from toilets, and eventually what happens is when they play when they play again, FaZe is super passive the entire time because they're afraid of challenging him. But there are multiple times in that matchup where FaZe or Fur isn't even playing aggressively. He's just like standing back in a normal passive position, but he he has created like so much mental damage, so much mental map control that he's taken over the game without having to take over the game. So that's like an example of that. And then finally, when we talk about passive map control, I think Device is probably the best choice. And this is Device from the Astralis of 2017 when he was the mobile opera on the CT side. And the reason I consider this the best choice is because, first off, this is this isn't a pure like passive Tasia style control. It's more like a combination of the Tasia and MVP style, because he was obviously a player who had studied a lot of enemy opponents and figured out how their ops were working and how to like play against those ops. But he was also a player who consciously always found a way to create multiple routes for himself on the CT side, and he would be able to choose which one he would use depending on the team or player he was focusing on. And he would always make sure that even though he was going out there looking for picks, looking for information, he'd always play an angle such that he could always get away, or he'd have somebody help him get away. And that's kind of how I think of Device, where he was getting this information. He was taking up an aggressive position, but it was like a passive position in terms of how easily he could get away, because it's not like he was in risk. He was in any type of risk when he's taking this map control. And so that's why I've always like rated him very highly as an opper, because that kind of information he's getting is incredibly important. I will say his mid game and late game needed a bit of work. When we look at the E-League Major, the one they won, basically Virtus Pro is able to figure out his rotations on the mid round and late round, because they were all very similar on train, and that's kind of how they countered him on the CT side. Obviously, he did work on that later on, and he did put in more variation to that. But that's kind of how the map control worked in CS:GO. Those are some examples. So now that I've talked about the theory of map control, basically, there are a few precepts overall I'd like to people to remember. Is obviously there are three types: passive, aggressive, and then like the mental mind control, like MVP, right? But each of those are not delineated or from each other. They're not exclusive from each other. Like they blend into each other all the time, especially in like a team game where you have multiple elements of aggression, multiple elements of passivity in a single team. Like SK has like 2.5 passive players and 2.5 aggressive players, depending on where Cold wants to play on a certain map. But usually it's more like 2 aggressive players and Fern Fallen, and 3 passive players in Taco, Fur, and Cold. Or it might just be like a switch between Fallen and Taco depending on the map, right? And so it becomes a bit more complicated, but basically when we're looking at map control, you have to figure out what type of map control they need at the time, and then the risk associated with it. So in general, passive map control is generally the least risky of the three, because you're gaining a lot without losing a lot in general. But you also have the problem of, if you do this style, it's a bit harder to do, and there are times where you don't do anything at all, or it looks like you're not doing anything at all, and that's like a problem. The aggressive map control style is more gambly, but because it's more gambly, it has a high reward in a sense, because sometimes you could just outright win the game with it. And so when you use this, it depends also upon the team style, the players, but it also depends on resources you're putting in. So, and when you talk about this kind of style, this is generally used for like Force Buys in CS:GO, or it's used in lineups where you have to break down the enemy base in Dota 2 within like 20 minutes, where you're always constantly attacking, always constantly on the move, and you have to take some kind of risk with your wards or with map rotations in order to win that game if you like fucked up the draft or something, right? And the mental mind control is obviously the most complicated because you don't necessarily know how much a player is preparing for or how much they know going in, and it differs very much upon the player. Because even if like somebody like Stewie did like study a bunch of players, like that might just get into his fucking head instead of and ruin his own game in a sense. And like when you talk, so it's always a bit complicated depending on how much they consciously know or how much they just know intuitively, or if maybe it was just a random guess, or maybe it's just like how the play styles clash. So that third type of map control is always the hardest to define, and it always depends on the information and evidence presented to you. All right, that's about it for my theories about map control. I'll see you guys later.